Hi, this is Mrs. Homer, and we're going to be looking at biodiversity and threats to biodiversity today. Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth or in a particular ecosystem, and it's really essential to the functioning and existence of all ecosystems as well as to a happy planet. Biodiversity, when I think of it mainly as having a lot of different species, so a variety of species. We call this species diversity. And when we look at species diversity, sometimes it's kind of hard to remember that we're not just talking about the different types of species, but a good balance of the number of those species. So if you look at plot A and B, they both have 5 species in them, but we would consider B more biodiverse because it has a greater species diversity. It has a greater number of each of those species and a good balance. So let's look at A. If something were to wipe out this broadleaf tree, it would really wreak havoc on this ecosystem and it would be hard for plot A to recover from that. But over in B, first of all, a disease would have a harder time spreading because these trees are more spread out. The same type of tree is more spread out. But there's also a way of recovery. If those trees are wiped out, the ecosystem can continue to exist. And so we don't just want to have a lot of species, we want to have a richness of those numbers and a good balance of those numbers for those species. But really, biodiversity encompasses more than just species diversity. There's also ecosystem and genetic diversity. Now, ecosystem diversity is just what it sounds like. It's a variety of ecosystem on our planet. And a lot of ecosystems today are threatened by human impact and human activities. There's also genetic diversity, and genetic diversity is just that diverse gene pool, which helps a species stay healthy and prevents it from going extinct. So we looked at microevolution, and in terms of microevolution, we have the ability to change if the environment changes because we have genetic diversity. And so these are the 3 types of diversity, which kind of all together make up biodiversity. And biodiversity is important for a lot of reasons, but basically, it maintains the health of an ecosystem by maintaining what we call homeostasis or a balance. And so, a balanced, healthy ecosystem being very biodiverse is going to be what we want for our planet. If you have a balanced ecosystem, you get a lot of benefits from that ecosystem. And so we're going to look at some of the benefits that biodiversity provides. And the first is just flat out materials. Having a higher level of biodiversity is going to provide a lot of materials for human use, such as food, fuels, and fiber, as well as a natural source of medicine. So lots of things that we can actually use for our benefit. A healthy ecosystem through biodiversity is also going to provide regulation and support for very important processes. So, things like the regulation of climate, air quality, water purification, and things like nutrient cycling, all of these are going to be affected by biodiversity. Having a more biodiverse ecosystem is going to lead to in the improvement of these processes. And so things like water quality, those are going to be directly impacted by having a biodiverse ecosystem. And then lastly, one of the benefits of biodiversity is really just enjoyment and cultural uses. And so we can kind of get in touch with nature. We can have some spiritual and cultural uses as well as just being able to get out there and enjoy nature. And so there are lots of benefits to having biodiversity, and there are a lot of reasons why we need to focus on maintaining biodiversity throughout our planet. And so, what are some of the threats or the human impacts to biodiversity? There are 5 of them that we're going to look at. The single greatest threat to biodiversity is habitat loss. So, humans change the way the planet looks. We do agriculture, land development, we pollute, we influence climate change. So we're changing landscape again and again. In fact, 50% of the forests that were here originally are destroyed. We have used a lot of the natural resources in terms of water as well. In fact, this diagram, I really like it because it focuses a little bit on North America, but it shows that 99% of the original temperate forests have been destroyed. And that agriculture here in North America has replaced nearly all of the grasslands. So as you're driving across North America, you're not seeing these beautiful, diverse grasslands, but instead we're seeing things like crops and agriculture replacing that. And so we're definitely changing the landscape and destroying habitats, which is causing the loss of biodiversity. So there are 4 other threats to biodiversity. We have something called overexploitation, which basically means we're harvesting species faster than they can reproduce. And we're doing this in lots of different ways. Overfishing. 90% of the world's large predatory fishes have disappeared. Overhunting. So we have driven bison out of the Great Plains. We've driven the black rhinos of Africa to extinction. We have unsustainable logging. So if you look at the current rate of logging, all of the world's rainforest would be gone in 100 years. And even things like unregulated pet trade and poaching influence the amount of biodiversity on our planet. So when we harvest species faster than they can reproduce, we threaten biodiversity. Overexploitation. Another threat would be pollution. This is just common sense. We have all these human activities that produce diverse pollutants that affect ecosystems. So we pollute the water, we have oil spills, we even deplete the ozone because of chemicals that we release into the atmosphere. There's air pollution. And so all of these pollutions make the ecosystem a little bit dirtier, if you will, which cause it to be like a harder place for animals and plants to continue to thrive. And so pollution is a huge threat to biodiversity. If we look at pollution a little closer, there's also another problem with pollution, and that's called biomagnification. And so biomagnification is what happens to pollutants as we go through a food chain. And so, if you can imagine things at the bottom of the food chain, when they take in a pollutant, that pollutant actually doesn't leave their body. And so, the contamination of their body increases. And then, as you go up the food chain, these smaller species get eaten, and then those species get eaten. And the contamination just continues to rise in each of the larger species. And so as we go up a food chain, pollutants become more concentrated. In this image over here, the pollutants are represented by the crosses. And you can see as we go up in the food chain, the pollutants become more concentrated. And this threatens those top level predators, which oftentimes kind of keep the entire ecosystem regulated. And so this is called biomagnification. And what is most threatened by biomagnification would be top predators. All right, another threat to biodiversity, and I would say this is probably the second greatest threat to biodiversity, would be invasive species, which is what we looked at last week. So those invasive species, those non-native species that can harm an environment. And this is because they don't have limiting factors to control their numbers. And these limiting factors are these invasive species prey and outcompete native species, they alter habitats, and they bring new disease. And then the last threat to biodiversity would be climate change. So climate change, there's a lot of evidence for it. The warming of the oceans, the glacial retreats, the rise of sea levels, the extreme weather events that we're seeing. And climate change has changed our landscape in lots of ways. We have lots of evidence of this, the glaciers breaking up and land being changed. Here in this graphic, you can see the average temperature of the global surface has been increasing compared to that steady output of the sun's energy. And so climate change is threatening biodiversity. There are two different ways that climate change can threaten biodiversity, the first being abiotic. And so some consequences of climate change that are abiotic would be the shrinking of the polar ice caps, coastal habitats flooding, even droughts and storms becoming more intense, and the acidification of the ocean. The biotic consequences of climate change would be extinctions, migration patterns changing, and even the change of the timing of different yearly events. So there are 5 big threats that humans have in terms of threatening biodiversity. There are a couple other things I want to just quickly look at or review when we talk about biodiversity. And the first is keystone species. A keystone species is just an organism that plays a really large role in its ecosystem, and it kind of keeps the entire ecosystem together. And why I bring these up is that if a keystone species is threatened, it will also threaten the biodiversity in that ecosystem. So in this image, you can see that when the sea star was removed, the biodiversity plummets. And so keystone species help us keep biodiversity within the ecosystem. And there are lots of different examples of keystone species, and there are lots of keystone species that are being threatened. For instance, the beaver and the sea otter, which are keystone species in their ecosystems. And then finally, we just need to touch on extinction as a reminder that when we do lose that biodiversity, it's through extinction, and that's when all members of the species has died. We can look at these endangered species that the number is rising year to year. More and more species are being endangered. And so it's important that we spend time, resources, and energy figuring out how to keep these species from going extinct. So I just included this last slide here. It's a quick vocabulary slide just in case you need to review any of the vocabulary words from this presentation. And otherwise, that's all I have. Let me know if you have any questions.